The young man sitting on the train bench in the Pensacola railway station on the afternoon of August 24th, 1877, was 24 years old and weighed about 160 pounds. He was wearing a dark suit, a pressed white shirt, and a soft hat pulled low across his forehead. His left hand rested on a folded newspaper. His right hand was tucked under the lapel of his coat, where the butt of a .44 caliber Colt cap and ball revolver sat against his ribs. The grip turned inward for a cross-body draw he had been practicing every single day since he was 15 years old. His name, on the train ticket he had purchased that morning, was J.H. Swain. His real name was John Wesley Hardin of Bonham, Texas. By his own count, written years later in the prison library at Huntsville, he had killed 42 men before that afternoon. The train was scheduled to leave the station at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, bound for Alabama. Hardin had been living quietly in the Florida Panhandle for almost 3 years, working timber, teaching school under his assumed name, raising a small daughter with his wife Jane. He believed on that afternoon that the state of Texas had finally lost his trail. He was wrong. Sitting 3 benches away from him, dressed in the dusty clothes of a traveling cattle buyer, was a Texas Ranger lieutenant named John Barclay Armstrong. Armstrong was 26 years old. He carried a long-barreled .45 caliber revolver in a cross-draw rig, and he walked with a slight limp from a self-inflicted gunshot wound he had received cleaning his own pistol in San Antonio the year before. Beside Armstrong sat a smaller man with a thick mustache. His name was Jack Duncan. He was a private detective from Dallas who had been working undercover for the Texas Ranger Frontier Battalion for almost a full year, posing as a cotton broker, intercepting letters between Hardin's father-in-law in Texas and Hardin's brother-in-law in Alabama. It was one of those intercepted letters, written in plain English on a sheet of cheap paper, that had given them the name J.H. Swain and the lumber town on the Florida-Alabama border. The train pulled into the station. The whistle blew. Armstrong rose from his bench. Duncan rose with him. And 2 local Pensacola officers, who had been waiting in the baggage car, walked quickly down the platform and boarded the passenger coach from the rear. Hardin saw them coming. He reached for the Colt under his coat. The revolver caught in his suspenders. He could not pull it free. Armstrong drew his own pistol, leaped across the aisle, and brought the long barrel down across Hardin's skull in a single, sweeping arc. The most feared gunman in the state of Texas, the man who had killed his first human being at the age of 15, and who would later claim 42 killings in his autobiography, was knocked unconscious in a passenger train without firing a single shot. One of his companions, a man named James Mann, drew a pistol and was shot dead by Armstrong almost in the same motion. 2 others were arrested without incident. The whole engagement took less than 90 seconds. And here is the question that has puzzled historians for more than a century. By the year 1877, the Texas Rangers were the most famous and most feared lawmen in the American West. They had hunted Comanche war parties across the Llano Estacado. They had broken up the Sutton-Taylor feud. They had run cattle thieves out of 3 counties. And yet, for almost 7 years, from the fall of 1870 until that August afternoon in Pensacola, the Rangers as an organization had quietly refused to mount a serious pursuit of the most dangerous fugitive in the entire state. The warrants were on file. The indictments were stacked 5 counties deep. The killings kept piling up. The newspapers in Dallas and Galveston and Austin were screaming for justice. And still, year after year, the Texas Rangers found other work to do. Why? That is the story we are going to tell tonight. The story of a Methodist preacher's son who killed 40 men before his 24th birthday, who was finally captured not by the Rangers, but by a single 26-year-old lieutenant who refused to take no for an answer and who wrote, from the prison library at Huntsville, one of the strangest, most boastful, and most revealing autobiographies in the history of the American frontier. Before we go any further, do me a small favor. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single comment, and I want to know who is sitting with me on this one. Whether you're in Texas, where this story belongs, or in Tennessee, or Pennsylvania, or California, or anywhere else across this country, drop your state in the comments below. And if you appreciate stories told the old way, slow, the way an old man would tell them to another old man on a long winter evening, with all the names and all the dates and all the small details the textbooks never bother with, then tap that subscribe button. We tell the stories the school books skip. That is the whole reason this channel exists. Now, let us go back to the beginning. John Wesley Hardin was born on the 26th of May, 1853, in a small farming community near the town of Bonham in Fannin County in the northeastern corner of Texas. His father was a circuit-riding Methodist preacher named James Gibson Hardin, although every member of the family and every neighbor in 3 counties called him Gip. Gip Hardin had a thin face, a long beard, and a voice that could fill a brush arbor revival tent without raising itself above conversation. He named his second surviving son after the founder of the Methodist denomination, the English evangelist John Wesley, who had died in London more than 60 years before. The hope, as Gip Hardin wrote in a family Bible, that survives to this day was that the boy would grow up to be a preacher himself. The boy did not grow up to be a preacher. He grew up to be the most prolific killer the American West would produce in the 19th century. The Hardin family was old Southern stock. John Wesley's great-grandfather had been a colonel in the North Carolina Provincial Congress. Cousins on his father's side included a Confederate general, a Union general, and 3 different members of the United States Congress. At the outbreak of the Civil War in the spring of 1861, Gip Hardin was elected a captain in a Confederate Texas regiment. His 9-year-old son, John Wesley, tried twice that summer to run away from home and enlist as a drummer boy. The mother caught him both times. The boy never forgave her for it. In 1859, the family settled in a small Trinity County community called Sumter, where Gip Hardin opened a school. He taught grammar and arithmetic and scripture to a single classroom that included his own son. The boy was bright. He learned to read before he was 6. He memorized whole chapters of the New Testament. He could recite the Sermon on the Mount from beginning to end without a single error, but he was also, by every account that survives from neighbors and former classmates, fierce, proud, easily insulted, and almost completely without fear. In 1867, when he was 14 years old, a classmate named Charles Sloter accused him of writing crude graffiti about a girl on the wall of the schoolhouse. Hardin denied it. Sloter charged him with a knife. Hardin pulled his own knife and nearly killed the boy in the schoolyard before the teacher could pull them apart. He was almost expelled. His father pleaded for one more chance. A year later, in November of 1868, the chance ran out. The boy was 15 years old. He was visiting an uncle's farm near Moscow, in Polk County, Texas. There he challenged a young black man named Major Holshausen, who was the former slave of his uncle and who was now a free man working for wages on the property. The two of them wrestled. Hardin won. According to Hardin's own account, written nearly 30 years later in the Huntsville prison library, Holshausen returned the next day, angry, waving a stick. Hardin drew a revolver his father did not know he was carrying. He fired 5 times. Major Holshausen was hit by every bullet. He bled to death 3 days later in a small cabin outside Moscow. The Freedmen's Bureau agent at Sumter, a Union lieutenant named Charles Schmidt, filed a written report on the 9th of December, 1868. The report still survives in the National Archives. It reads, in part, Hardin, a mere lad, shot him without cause, as the latter did not like the abuse of Hardin. He shot him 5 times, every wound dangerous. No action was taken by civil authorities. Hardin left the county. Hardin's father, the Methodist preacher, refused to surrender his son to the federal occupation authorities. Texas, in the fall of 1868, was still under military reconstruction. The state police force, when it was formed 2 years later, would include hundreds of former slaves. Gip Hardin was convinced, perhaps correctly, that his 15-year-old son would not survive a trial in any Union-controlled courtroom in East Texas. He ordered the boy into hiding. That decision, made by a Methodist preacher trying to protect his son, set in motion the next 27 years of John Wesley Hardin's life. The boy never went home again. Within 3 weeks of the killing of Major Holshausen, according to Hardin's autobiography, 3 United States soldiers were dispatched from a small federal post to arrest him. He met them at a creek crossing called Nogales Prairie in what is now Trinity County. He was waiting in the brush with a double-barrel shotgun and a 6-shooter. He claimed in his autobiography that he killed all 3 before any of them could fire a single shot. The military records of the 4th United States Cavalry do not name him, but circumstantial evidence in the federal records of the 5th Military District indicates that a triple killing did indeed take place at that crossing in those weeks, and that no one was ever convicted of it. He was 16 years old. He had killed 4 men. He was, from that morning forward, a fugitive. For the next 2 years, he drifted across central Texas under a half-dozen aliases, sleeping in haylofts, sleeping in caves, sleeping in the cabins of distant cousins of the Clements family, the Bowen family, the Dixon family, all of them old Confederate stock from the same Methodist circuit his father had ridden before the war. He taught school for a few weeks in a settlement called Pisgah in Navarro County. He worked briefly as a cowhand on a small ranch near Corsicana. He won and lost small fortunes at the gambling tables of frontier saloons. And almost everywhere he went, the killings continued. In January of 1870, in a small town called Towash in Hill County, Hardin was playing cards with a man named Benjamin Bradley. He won almost every hand. Bradley threatened to cut out his liver. That night, according to Hardin's own account, Bradley followed him into the street and opened fire. Hardin drew both pistols and shot Bradley once in the head and once in the chest. Dozens of witnesses saw the gunfight. They reported that Hardin's holsters were sewn directly into the lining of his vest, with the pistol butts turned inward across his chest. To draw, he crossed his arms in front of him and pulled both weapons simultaneously. He had been practicing the cross draw every single morning for almost 2 years. By the time he was 17, he could clear leather and fire 2 shots in less than a second and a half. In January of 1871, he was arrested for the first time for the killing of a Waco town marshal named Laban John Hoffman. He denied that particular killing. While being transported under guard to Waco for trial, he bought a small pocket revolver from another prisoner for $5. On the trail, a state policeman named Jim Smalley began to taunt and beat him with the butt of his pistol. Hardin pretended to cry. He huddled against the side of his horse. And while Smalley was looking the other way, the 17-year-old prisoner pulled the hidden revolver and shot the lawman in the chest. He took Smalley's horse and rode away. The body was found the next morning. The kill made the front page of the Dallas Herald. It was the first time the name John Wesley Hardin appeared in print east of the Trinity River. By the summer of that year, 1871, he was riding north on the Chisholm Trail as the trail boss of a cattle herd belonging to his cousins, the Clements brothers. He was 18 years old. He killed at least 3 Mexican vaqueros in a feud over grazing rights along the South Canadian River in the Indian Territory. He killed an unknown number of Plains Indians who tried to collect what was essentially a passage tax on the herd crossing tribal land. And when the herd finally reached Abilene, Kansas, at the end of the summer, he walked into the most famous cattle town in the West and introduced himself, under the alias Wesley Clements, to the town marshal. The town marshal was a man named James Butler Hickok. The newspapers called him Wild Bill. The meeting between Wild Bill Hickok and the young John Wesley Hardin on the wooden sidewalks of Abilene in the summer of 1871 is one of the most disputed encounters in the entire history of the American West. Hardin claimed, in his autobiography, that he had been ordered to surrender his pistols, that he had pretended to comply, that he had performed what gunfighters of the era called the road agent's spin, flipping the revolvers in his hands as he passed them across, so that Hickok was suddenly staring down 2 loaded muzzles instead of 2 grips. He claimed, in writing, that he had backed Wild Bill Hickok down in the middle of Texas Street. No contemporary newspaper account confirms the story. Hickok himself, who was killed by an assassin named Jack McCall in Deadwood 5 years later, never wrote a word about it. What is certain is that the 2 men did meet, and that whatever happened in that meeting, Hickok afterward allowed the young Texan to carry his pistols openly inside the Abilene city limits, a privilege he extended to almost no one else. 3 weeks later, in the small hours of the morning on August 6, 1871, in a hotel room on the 2nd floor of the American House in Abilene, Hardin was awakened by the snoring of a cattleman named Charles Coger in the adjacent room. He shouted at the man through the wall. The snoring continued. Hardin, drunk and furious, drew his pistol and fired 4 times through the plaster. One of the bullets struck Charles Coger in the heart as he lay sleeping. Hardin climbed out the 2nd-story window onto the hotel roof and watched as Wild Bill Hickok arrived in the street below with 4 police officers. He waited until the policemen entered the hotel. Then he jumped from the roof into the alley, hid in a haystack until dawn, stole a horse, and rode south. He never set foot in Kansas again. The Abilene Daily Chronicle ran a single paragraph the next morning. The story said only that a man called Arkansas had killed a stranger in his bed at the American House Hotel and had escaped. It described the incident as the killer's 6th murder. Years later, after Hardin became famous, the newspapers across the country would print and reprint a single sentence about him that almost no one in the West ever forgot. The sentence read, "John Wesley Hardin, so mean, he once killed a man just for snoring too loud." The killings continued. The Sutton-Taylor feud, the bloodiest civilian vendetta in Texas history, drew him in by the spring of 1873. He killed a deputy sheriff named J.B. Morgan in the town of Cuero on the 17th of May. He killed the DeWitt County Sheriff, a former Texas State Police captain named Jack Helm, the next day, in the small settlement of Albuquerque, Texas, by walking up to him in the dusty street and firing both barrels of a 12-gauge shotgun into his chest at point-blank range. He was 20 years old. The Sutton faction posted a $1,000 reward on his head. The Texas state authorities issued warrants in 5 counties. And here is where the strange silence of the Texas Rangers begins. The Texas Rangers, as an organized state law enforcement agency, had been refounded by the Texas legislature in the spring of 1874, after the end of Reconstruction, under a captain named Leander McNelly. The Frontier Battalion, the larger of the 2 Ranger commands, was assigned to fight Comanche and Apache raiding parties along the western frontier and to break up cattle rustling operations along the Rio Grande. The Special Force, McNelly's smaller command, was assigned to clean up South Texas. Both commands were small. Both commands were funded on a shoestring. And both commands, by every internal communication that survives in the Texas State Archives in Austin, were openly reluctant to take on the John Wesley Hardin case. There were reasons for that reluctance. Some of them were practical. Hardin was protected, almost everywhere he went in Central and East Texas, by a network of cousins and in-laws and old Confederate neighbors who would lie to any lawman who knocked on a door asking questions. He moved constantly. He never slept in the same cabin 2 nights running. He carried 2 pistols at all times and slept with a 3rd under his pillow. The Rangers knew that any pursuit of Hardin would likely cost the lives of 3 or 4 good men before it ended. Captain McNelly, in a letter to the Adjutant General dated December of 1874, wrote that hunting Hardin in his own country would be, in McNally's exact phrase, a waste of better men than the boy is worth. But there were also political reasons. Hardin's family was old Confederate. The Methodist circuit his father had ridden before the war ran through the heart of the same counties where the Rangers recruited most of their men. There were Rangers in 1874, perhaps more than a few of them, who had been Confederate soldiers 10 years earlier alongside Hardin's father. There were Rangers who had stood at his christening. There were Rangers whose own younger brothers were riding with the Clements family in Gonzales County. To send those men to hunt the preacher's son would have torn the frontier battalion apart from the inside. Captain McNally understood that. So did Governor Richard Koch. So did the Adjutant General. And so, for almost 3 more years, the warrants sat in the file drawers in Austin, gathering dust, while John Wesley Hardin killed and killed and killed. The killing that finally changed everything happened on the 26th of May, 1874. It was Hardin's 21st birthday. He had ridden into the town of Comanche, in Comanche County, Texas, with his brother Joseph and a small group of cousins to celebrate. They were drinking in a saloon when a Brown County deputy sheriff named Charles Webb walked through the door. Webb was an honest, careful, well-liked lawman. He was also carrying in his coat pocket an arrest warrant for one of Hardin's group. The 2 men spoke briefly. Hardin invited the deputy to step into a hotel for a drink. As Webb followed him through the doorway, according to 2 surviving witness accounts, Webb began to draw his pistol. One of Hardin's cousins shouted a warning. Hardin spun and fired. Deputy Charles Webb fell dead on the threshold of the Beckham Hotel in Comanche, Texas. The pistol Hardin used that afternoon, a .44 caliber Smith & Wesson Russian model, serial number 25,274, would later be auctioned to a private collector for more than $160,000. The killing of Charles Webb was the killing that finally broke the silence. Webb was not a feud member. He was not a state policeman from the Reconstruction years. He was a popular hometown lawman in a small Texas town, doing his job in broad daylight with a legal warrant in his pocket. A lynch mob formed within an hour. Hardin's parents and his wife were taken into protective custody by friends. His brother Joseph and 2 of his cousins, the Dixon brothers, were arrested on outstanding charges and locked in the Comanche jail. On the night of the 18th of July, 1874, a mob of local men broke into the jail and hanged all 3 of them from a single tree at the edge of town. The ropes, according to witnesses who came forward years later, were deliberately left too long so that the men would not die from broken necks but would strangle slowly. Grass was found between the toes of Joseph Hardin's bare feet, where he had reached for the ground in his final minutes. John Wesley Hardin was 3 counties away when his brother died. He never returned to Comanche. He never saw his father alive again. And from that month forward, the Texas Rangers no longer had a choice. The killing of Charles Webb had crossed a line that even the Methodist Confederate veterans in the Frontier Battalion could not pretend to ignore. On the 20th of January, 1875, the Texas legislature, at the request of Governor Richard B. Hubbard, authorized a reward of $4,000 for the arrest of John Wesley Hardin, dead or alive. It was the largest single reward ever posted by the state up to that date. The Frontier Battalion forwarded the warrant to every ranger company in the state. And in a quiet office in Austin, a lieutenant of Ranger Company E, a young man named John Barclay Armstrong, walked into the office of his commanding officer, Captain Lee Hall, and asked, in writing, to be assigned to the case. John Barclay Armstrong was 25 years old in the spring of 1876. He had been born in McMinnville, Tennessee, in 1850. He had moved to Austin in 1871, joined McNally's Special Force in 1875, fought Mexican bandits along the lower Rio Grande, and earned a reputation in the battalion as McNally's bulldog. He limped slightly from a self-inflicted gunshot wound he had received cleaning his own pistol earlier that year. He was lean, soft-spoken, and almost impossible to discourage. When Captain Hall told him the Hardin case had been worked off and on for almost 7 years with nothing to show, Armstrong said, in words that were later quoted by a ranger sergeant named John R. Hughes, "Then it is time someone finished it." Armstrong was given a single assistant. The assistant was a Dallas private detective named Jack Duncan, who had worked undercover before for the Texas Adjutant General. Together, the 2 men did something the Texas Rangers as an organization had never tried in the Hardin case. They stopped looking in Texas. They started reading mail. For most of the year, 1876, Duncan operated under a cover identity as a cotton broker traveling through East Texas and Louisiana. He befriended Hardin's father-in-law. He befriended Hardin's brother-in-law. He sat at the same dinner tables. He drank the same coffee. He shook the same hands. And every letter that passed between those men and their fugitive relative, somewhere in the East, was opened, copied, resealed, and forwarded to Armstrong in Austin. By June of 1877, Armstrong had intercepted a letter from Joshua Robert Bowen, Hardin's brother-in-law, addressed to a man named J. H. Swain at a small lumber camp on the Alabama-Florida border. The letter mentioned, in passing, that Swain had been seen the previous week boarding a train in Pensacola. Armstrong read the letter twice. Then he got on a train of his own. He arrived in Pensacola, Florida, on the 23rd of August, 1877. He spent the next 19 hours coordinating with the local sheriff and arranging for 2 Pensacola officers to be present, in plain clothes, on the platform of the railway station. The next afternoon, at 3 minutes past 3 o'clock in the afternoon, John Wesley Hardin walked onto the platform with 3 companions, climbed into a passenger car, and sat down on a wooden bench facing the rear of the train. Armstrong waited until the whistle blew. Then he stood up, drew his long-barreled .45 caliber Colt, and walked the length of the aisle. The fight, as we said at the beginning, lasted less than 90 seconds. Hardin's pistol caught in his suspenders. Armstrong pistol-whipped him unconscious. One of Hardin's companions, James Mann, drew a weapon and was killed instantly. The other 2 surrendered. The most dangerous gunman in the state of Texas was lifted off the floor of a Florida passenger train, carried to the Pensacola jail, and held there for the long train ride back to Austin. The headline in the Galveston Daily News the following week read simply, "Hardin taken alive." The trial was held in Comanche, Texas, in May and June of 1878. The charge was the killing of Deputy Charles Webb. The verdict was guilty. The sentence, handed down by Judge J.P. Osterhout on the 5th of June, was 25 years in the Texas State Penitentiary at Huntsville. Hardin was 25 years old. He would not walk out of Huntsville a free man until he was 40. He served 17 of the 25 years before he was released on the 17th of February, 1894, on a combination of good time and a partial pardon signed by Governor James Stephen Hogg. During those 17 years, he was an unusual prisoner, by every account that survives in the Huntsville records. He attempted to tunnel into the prison armory once, in 1879, with 50 other convicts, and was stopped within hours of breaking through. He was bedridden for almost 2 full years, between 1883 and 1885, with the recurring infection of an old gunshot wound to his kidney. He read theological books. He became, of all things, the superintendent of the prison Sunday school, teaching scripture to other convicts the way his father had once taught it to him in the Sumter schoolhouse. He read law. He passed the Texas State Bar examination in July of 1894, 5 months after his release. He was by then a licensed attorney. And in the small, dim cell where he spent most of his nights for almost 2 decades, with a single oil lamp and a stack of cheap paper, he wrote the manuscript that would become, after his death, one of the strangest documents in the literature of the American West. He titled it The Life of John Wesley Hardin, from the original manuscript as written by himself. In its pages, he claimed credit for 42 killings. Some of those killings, like Major Holshausen and Benjamin Bradley and Charles Webb, are documented in court records and contemporary newspaper accounts. Others, perhaps a third of the total, cannot be verified by any source independent of Hardin himself. Modern historians believe the true number was at least 20 and probably no more than 30. But Hardin, sitting in that prison cell, writing in the steady hand of a man who had once been the second best Bible student in Trinity County, wanted credit for 42. He wanted the world to know exactly who he had been. He was killed in the Acme Saloon on El Paso Street on the night of the 19th of August, 1895. 18 months after his release from Huntsville. He had been drinking and rolling dice with a local merchant. His last words, spoken to the merchant just before midnight, were 4 sixes to beat. A 56-year-old former lawman named John Selman, Sr., with whom Hardin had quarreled the previous afternoon, walked into the saloon, came up behind him at the bar, and shot him once in the back of the head with a Colt .45 caliber revolver, serial number 141,805. Hardin was dead before he hit the floor. Selman fired 3 more rounds into the body as it lay on the sawdust. He claimed at trial that he had seen Hardin reach for a pistol in the bar mirror. A hung jury released him on bond. 8 months later, on the 6th of April, 1896, Selman himself was shot dead behind a livery stable by a United States deputy marshal named George Scarborough during an argument over a card game. John Wesley Hardin was buried the next day in Concordia Cemetery, on the eastern edge of El Paso, in a plain pine coffin paid for by his estranged son. His grave is still there today. It is one of the most visited tourist sites in El Paso County. A century after his death, in August of 1995, 2 groups of his descendants and his admirers stood in that cemetery and nearly came to blows over whether his body should be moved to lie beside the grave of his first wife in Nixon, Texas. A judge ruled in favor of leaving him in El Paso. The body has not been moved. Now think for a moment about what this story actually is. A Methodist preacher in 1868 refused to surrender his 15-year-old son to a federal occupation court that the father did not trust. The boy went into hiding. The hiding became a hab.